Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest episode of the Define Tomorrow podcast. Today, we're digging into modern management, navigating that maze of understanding what modern management is, how it can benefit your business, and most importantly, how to make it work for you. I'd like to introduce my two co-hosts that are going to help me on today's subject. First of all, Oli Restorek.
Hello.
And last but not least, Andy Isles.
Hello.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, both of you, for joining me. So today we're talking all about modern management. And normally when we're talking about this as a concept, and we live very much in the Microsoft world, we're talking about two main technologies. So we've got Intune and Autopilot. Let's kind of start with, first of all, going back a step and talking about why is it important? Why are people looking at it? Why is it so relevant? And Oli, in your role as a pre-sales architect, probably makes sense to come to you with that bit as you're kind of at the forefront of discussing this with our customers.
Yeah, I think we've probably been blessed, if that's the right word, with having, let's say, 23 years. Windows 2000 came out in about 2000, thereabouts. Obviously, we've been blessed in having a really long run of having group policy and all those tools at our hands, and we got very, very familiar with them. And the world has changed in those 23 years. Going back, you had all your desktops behind your firewall. You had nobody really going off site. That was an exception. And we've come full circle, and we have a lot of our workforce out and about using devices outside the office. Data is in the cloud, not behind our secured firewall. And a lot of us are still using those same old technologies to manage these things in the new world. And it doesn't really fit. So modern management steps in and hopefully solves some of those challenges.
Don't know that I've ever heard someone describe being blessed to have group policy before. As someone that quite extensively managed group policy in a very distant past of mine, I think I was hated on by everybody and hated myself most of the time because it was so complicated to try and figure out what was going wrong that I had to try and unpick it all.
Absolutely. That's probably one of the things, actually, one of the real weaknesses, there are many with group policy, is that you don't know if a setting is taken or not. You merrily sit there and click, and you have no idea if that setting has actually done anything, whether it's even reached the workstation or whether it's done what it's meant to. So Intune really helps with that. You can see if something's failing, it'll actually tell you about it, which is good.
So we're now kind of in this world of what we're referring to as the modern workspace, which is all about that flexibility that users want to be able to work everywhere. IT are moving the applications everywhere. IT needs to still secure and control what's going on. And I think that's really where modern management is coming in and fitting and replacing the legacy that you're mentioning, Oli. But Andy, as someone that is at the forefront of getting this actually working for our customer. Me and Oli are in the job of selling the dream. You're in the job of delivering the dream, being part of our engineering
at the
team.
coalface, yeah.
Exactly. Talk to me at a very high level. What are the key components when it comes to Microsoft and modern management?
So I suppose the main key component, obviously, is the Intune control panel, really. So that's where we're setting your policies, applications, etc., and linking that into the existing infrastructure, if you like. So we're using things like an Intune connector, certificate management, doing all that through Intune to sort of push these policies and things to these new devices, as well as to some of the old devices. And I suppose one of the bigger challenges is how do you keep that one pane of glass for all your configurations? You said there, sort of with your group policy objects that are going to be on site. How do you replace them, or how do you take over some of the management of that with Intune?
And the other part that we see, and Oli, I suppose, more part of selling the dream, because we get to visualize a world when these things are fully implemented and working, is the autopilot part of that story. And autopilot, I think, is often confused because it's not a product in its own right. Am I right in saying that?
No, it's a feature of Windows. So Windows Autopilot, it's just basically part of the setup. So we're familiar with the thing that's been called UBI, which you may or may not be familiar with, out-of-box experience. That's really Windows setting itself up, coming straight out of the box from whatever manufacturer you choose, and getting basically the settings up and getting the user productive. So Autopilot automates that piece. So you will have seen, anyone who's worked in IT any length of time will have manually set up Windows 10 or 11. You see at least 15 questions asking, who's the device owned by? What keyboard do you want? do you want to enable Cortana? That's dead now in Windows 11, but that will soon be going. You'll see all these questions being asked. So Autopilot just scraps those and makes a nice, easy experience for a user to log in for the first time using their Office 365 credentials.
Wasn't Ubi something to do with Star Wars?
Don't ask me.
I'm really not good enough. It's Obi-Wan Kenobi, isn't it?
Oh, Obi, yeah.
Is that a different spin on it? There we go. But yeah, so ultimately Autopilot allows the user to kind of get that out of the box experience, get the joy of taking off the screen protector that we all love, and not having to deal with the fact that the IT team have got their, not that we have grubby fingerprints us in IT, but sometimes maybe we're not as careful as we need to not to tarnish a new device and keep the experience one for the user. So I think it's a good example of where two technologies there can come together to deliver a fantastic experience for the user. But as we're on the Define Tomorrow podcast, not our sister podcast, the Adopt 365 podcast, this is all about the technologists and what do we need to do to get this working. So Andy, do you want to talk us through some of the kind of stages and considerations that go into an Intune Autopilot project? The challenge that I see is if you speak to a lot of people and we go, are you using Intune Autopilot? The answer is always yes. Yet actually what that can mean and the degrees of configuration and implementation can be from very little to completely and utterly automated, secured and managed with Intune. So give us a little bit of a view into your world as to what do these projects look like?
So I suppose one of the big questions at the start of the project is, are you going to be hybrid joining your devices, or will you look to just Azure AD join them, or Entra AD join them? I suppose we should say Entra join them. There's a few considerations there. So there's things like the policies that are going to be applied to the computer. Do we need to change those? Do we need to start applying them through Intune? A lot of the user configuration, so map drives, etc. Do we need to start applying them and having those running through Intune? I suppose one of the questions is, if we're going to be Entra joining the devices, do they need to, and at what level do they need to access some of the on-site resources? So I've dealt with a customer where we've AAD joined the devices and just used a Z-scaler to connect into the on-site resources. That works pretty well, sort of no issues there. You get the element of the security compliance that's provided by Intune on one side, and you can still hook into these, let's call them older applications, historic applications that people are using, but using all of the new technology features that we're getting, modern features from Intune to get there. Yeah, so that's what I said on that piece.
And typically, I mean, these projects can look like, I think, from my perspective, and maybe Oli, you'll be able to confirm if my thinking on this is correct, but when it comes to Intune and Autopilot, the bare minimum configuration that we see is a device being enrolled in Intune, and typically a base level of policies being configured, such as, and normally the one that we see is the encryption, the BitLocker encryption, a good way.
You'll see configuration profiles for BitLocker as being a minimum, but it's also a compliance policy just to measure that some basics are being done. So, is it BitLockered? Is there a minimum version of Windows that's installed? If you want to. Not so many people do these days, but yeah, you could choose some of those options.
So it would kind of be a typical deployment for a customer wanting to get started, and maybe the one that we see a lot of customers having in place where they're answering the question, yeah, we've done Autopilot, we've done Intune kind of thing, is the fact that the device is being registered against either Azure Active Directory or a hybrid join scenario, as you mentioned there, Andy, and they've then looked at the policies, of which, and from the brief amount of time I've looked into, there looks to be even more than group policy, maybe not quite as many with how group policy has evolved, but differing options. And one thing that was confusing to me, not someone that is completely unfamiliar with these kind of things, but someone that doesn't do it like in my day job like you do, Andy, is the fact that you've got to pick the right mix of those kind of policies, because some of them can actually go against other policies that you may be configuring. So part of the skill is kind of understanding what policies, what mix, and what is right for the customer to be deploying, I suppose.
I think that's really true when you're in a hybrid environment and you're trying to unpick maybe decades of group policy settings, and you're trying to work out which order do you do it in? There's many ways to carve up an organization. Do you do it by team? Do you do it across applications? And that's a really big consideration. I think you never end up with quite the same answer each time you run those for different organizations. And you were talking there, Barry, about organizations saying they've done Intune, and a lot of those will have actually done maybe some MDM. So they will have had a competing MDM product, and they're using Intune for that and not really touched the Windows side of things. So that's another instance where customer says, yep, using Intune, and you dig in and actually nothing much is being done with Windows, which is really where the strength is.
Good point. MDM obviously being mobile device management, and people will be using it to manage their iPhones or Android phones or something like that in a central point. So we've kind of just spoke about the kind of basic there, and maybe Oli, I'll come to you first, but then maybe Andy, you might want to expand. Sell the dream. If you meticulously work on Intune, Autopilot, and everything in between, maybe even then bringing in some of the other services like Defender and things like that. What's the epitome today of where you could go with this? So sell a story, a dream of how it could be.
I think the dream always goes back to the end user experience. So a really good implementation of Intune and Autopilot is where the user gets to log in. They don't get lots of dialog boxes chucked up with them. They've got no idea. They don't have to configure OneDrive manually. They don't have to configure their applications because it's all there and all there for you. And the same with the device reset scenario where you're replacing a device. That should all just work. I think that's the epitome of a decent installation.
Got anything to expand on that, Andy? And what's the complexity about making Oli's dream come true?
Yeah, I mean, I echo what Oli says there. I mean, to expand on it, it's that journey that the user's going on, sort of as they're logging in there, and the policies and things they're getting to that machine or on that machine as a sort of base policy set, but also expanding that out as well. You touched on sort of there the mobile phones, etc. So we know a user in a certain department has a certain amount of configuration settings and security, and that's not just on their Windows machine, that's across accessing that data on any application, really. So whether it be on their phone, tablet, or on their workstation, and having sort of different configurations for different parts of the company, I suppose, to access that data.
I think the dream is actually also about making the life of the IT person easier. You're never going to sell that to your boss. You're never going to sell that to the CEO saying, I'd like you to invest in this to make my life easier. That's never really a good sell, but it is in essence. But if you can get those devices out without having batches of laptops stored in the basement that you never get around to deploying because you're doing lots of manual processes, and you can get them sent straight out to the end user, or even just make it an easier process to do in-house in the office, I think that's a great thing.
And so we spoke about that kind of onboarding experience, the ability to kind of automate, but also enhance the controls around how a device is used. But one of the features also of, and I think I'm getting this right, is Autopilot, but probably in conjunction with Intune, is the reset feature that can be used by a service desk and things like that. Andy, how do you see that being used? What benefits does that bring?
So yeah, it can be used by a service desk, or we can set it so the end users can do it as well. And I suppose the big benefit of that is a user may have a problem, whereas in the past, an issue with an application, it may take a couple of hours to fix over a couple of different calls, etc., with a first line or second line engineer. With the reset facility, if a user goes to lunch, we can say just reset your machine, and because we know we've got the configuration policies, the application installs all working correctly in the right way that we've designed, it will reset the machine, put all that information back on there. As Oli said earlier, with other policies like OneDrive locking in automatically, normally fine within an hour, they reset the machine and it's back to kind of where it was. The application, the operating system has all been completely reinstalled again. 9 times out of 10, that'll fix the problem. I don't want to say, I suppose it's a fancy turn off and on again, you could call it, a modern turn it off and on again. But yeah, we know that it's the working configuration and design is then back on that laptop. And as I say, that'll fix most issues and problems.
There's always been that trade-off, hasn't there, as to how much time and effort are you going to spend fixing that broken application when you know if you just blow it all away and start again, it's probably going to work fine. But if you keep having to do that, I guess your users are going to get pretty frustrated if you're seeing the same problems over and over again.
Oh yeah,
That's the
definitely look at the core issue to the program.
Yeah, for sure.
That's the real question then. That if the IT crowd was still being filmed today and Moss were there, would he still be asking, have you tried to turn it off and on again, or would he just be resetting everything in autopilot?
Yeah, can you reset your machine?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we've got a kind of good understanding of some of the what's possible, where we see most people today, and where they're looking to get to. Andy, whenever we're talking to customers about the practicalities of deploying Intune, and I apologise if I'm throwing all kinds of curveballs at you here, but a good conversation is forming. You always mention personas and the importance of personas. Talk a little bit around what a persona is and how they apply to an Intune project.
So if we take it from the standpoint of we've got a base configuration, so that may be something along the lines of the machine gets BitLocker encrypted, has Office 365 clients installed on it. So that we know that's the sort of base persona for everyone across the organization. Then we might find in finance may use a Sage application. They may have a slightly different level of encryption or slightly different configuration in regards to a security policy. So we call the finance team a persona in that case. So what we would normally like to do is layer it based on user access. So that's a user control. So if you're in that finance team, automatically you get Sage installed on your machine, and you also get the finance security configurations put on your machine. But as I say, expanding that out, that persona can be used in multiple different ways. So we can use it with a slate of different configurations across multiple devices. So they may have slightly, an extra add-in added into Office, etc. So the sort of base foundation of mapping all of that out. Once you've got it mapped out and it's configured and it's in, from a sort of support perspective, you know that if someone joins finance, you just have to add them to that one persona, and it'll take care of itself. So that's the beauty of managing it that way.
That's really clear. So I think it's good to kind of try and simplify not only what we're doing for the users, but how we're managing this in IT. And I think this will also relate to some of the day two problems that we'll get to towards the end of the podcast. One key principle that, Oli, I just want to make sure we've covered, because it's an area that I struggle to get my head around initially. So those of us that are a little bit more, I don't want to say long in the tooth, been around for a while, will be very used to imaging laptops, and I remember my Ghost CD-ROM that I used to boot stuff from and things like that. And then we also remember the pain of packaging applications for things like SCCM and things like that. So Intune takes a different policy to those legacy technologies, doesn't it? Did you want to talk around how it differs to those legacy principles?
Yeah, it's basically the parallel of going in and getting a new mobile phone from, let's say, Carphone Warehouse or whoever. What you don't do when you get your new Apple device, you don't delete everything that Apple's put on the device and start again and put your own image there. You build on the OS that's been shipped there. So anyone who's ever got particularly a consumer laptop and tried to reinstall Windows and then find all the drivers for it knows how complex that is. Why not just get Windows plus the drivers deployed by the OEM? OEMs have got a much better at not putting what we call crapware or craplets all over your laptops. So you're not going to get a trial version of Norton Antivirus on a PC that's designed and delivered for Autopilot. So yes, you will get Windows and the drivers. You might get a trial of Office, but actually the installer for Office in Intune is actually clever enough to recognize a trial version and just convert it to the full version. So actually it's an advantage. There's less bits and bytes coming over the wire to upgrade that trial up to a full version. So that's better. So
someone that spent many years working at Dixon's, you no longer get the FreeServe trial on the desktop anymore then.
That's right.
I don't know how long FreeServe hasn't been a thing, but I think I did find a CD-ROM for FreeServe the other day when going through a drawer, but there we go. So we've got a different principle. We're not overwriting everything's there. We're taking advantage of what is there and then customizing it based upon what then is needed, based upon the personas that Andy has just spoken about.
Yeah, I mean, imaging worked great in the sort of Windows XP era when nobody was actually patching their devices. And then, of course, you need service packs, you need more and more patches, applications getting patched ever more frequently. And if you've got an image that's a year old, that's pretty much insecure straight out of the box. You're much better off starting with a nice, fresh install of Windows that's actually up to date and then bringing the current versions of the applications onto that as a layer.
I'm sure I remember the legacy, and I'm sure it was a Microsoft technology. And if anyone knows about it, it'll be Oli. That was the ability to pixie boot a thin client from the network with the whole Windows image being streamed down to it.
Yes, I remember that. I don't know what it's called, but I definitely
No.
remember.
We'll see if by the end of the podcast someone can remember that.
Yeah.
But it promised everything. It was kind of like the dream that VDI maybe delivered a few years later. I don't know if we can use VDI and dream in the same sentence, but this is really about the modern way of working, aligning to that kind of iPhone type experience, Android if you prefer not to be related to Apple technologies, and getting that out of box experience. So Andy, typically when customers are looking to do these projects, there will be a mixture of new devices and there will be a mixture of existing devices. Talk to me about how you handle and what is needed to be done to register a new device in Intune and using Autopilot, and what needs to happen with the existing devices.
So it's actually very simple at the moment. So if we've got a hybrid join configuration, let's say, what we would do is create a set of configurations for the existing fleet of machines, normally a group policy, in order to integrate that and add those into Intune. What we'll do sort of prior to that is have a distinction between, say, autopilot machines, so machines that are directly in there, or these older machines, and we do that with a dynamic group. So that means that any policies, applications we know, and we can distinguish between those two groups of machines what we want to have on there. As far as adding the existing machine into Intune, as I say, there's a group policy. We can do that through that method. That's a case of just applying that to the OU, getting the user to log in and out a couple of times, and then you'll see it pop up into Intune. We can also talk users through adding them manually, signing into certain apps. It'll do it that way. That's to get it in there. And then when we've got the sort of two there running side by side, certain tools and reports that we can use, and we can pull out a set of group policy objects that are being applied to a machine. We can have a look. Intune will tell us what it can do natively. There may be certain ones we want to do in a slightly different way within Intune, so a slightly different type of policy within there. And then we can decide at a machine level, on a policy level, which we want to win, I suppose you'd call it. Do we want the group policy to win, or do we want the Intune policy to win? As Oli alluded to a little bit earlier, they work in a slightly different way. Sometimes when there's conflicts, it won't apply the policy at all, or it won't apply that part of the policy. Whereas in group policy, obviously, it works slightly different as it moves down the tree. Yeah, so then by the end of that, we've sort of got the old and new in there, working in the same way, I suppose.
And Oli, I'm right in thinking that when customers are buying Autopilot enrolled devices from us, it's just a matter of getting, is it the ID for their tenant or something like that that we pass on when they're purchased?
Yeah, it's two things. There's a hardware hash, which is a big long number that uniquely references a PC. It's made up of things like the serial number of the motherboard and lots of other bits, but it's a number that's never going to change throughout the life of that PC. And it uniquely references that PC. That needs to be put up in Intune into the tenant, and we need the tenant ID to be able to do that. So yeah. So
effectively, the customers come in buying, I think it's predominantly Dell and Microsoft devices from us, whilst other vendors may be available. That when they are coming to us, that we're making that happen for them in terms of knowing the devices that are coming. We've already got their tenant information, so that device can be delivered directly to a home user's front door. Yep. They can sit down at their kitchen table, they can sign in with their details. Within a matter of minutes, they're going through the process, and then the device will then finalize being built, depending on the complexity of what's happening, probably within a half an hour to an hour period. Is that typically what you're seeing there, Andy?
I'd say 40 minutes is probably around the time that I think is right.
At least, yeah. And to expand on that again, we can also get those hardware hashes from existing fleets as well, through a variety of different methods. So we sort of went back earlier with the dream of resetting kind of a machine to fix an issue. We could then do that with the existing fleet. We're seeing things there and get them running through the autopilot configuration.
And we've always found whenever you do a reset and bring people through autopilot, having your service desk on hand and having that proactive conversation is a much better way of doing it. Get the service desk to phone up the user and talk them through it, rather than giving them some instructions and saying, give us a call if you have a problem. It's the proactiveness of that makes it.
I think that's an important point here, because we're trying to improve experience here, and I think the two things can often get misaligned. That IT departments have been building these laptops for a long time because of security and because of the perception the user couldn't do it. So then the perception is that you're going to use Intune and Autopilot and it can go straight out to the user, so IT shouldn't have to be involved. Where actually there's an opportunity here for IT to ensure that there's a better experience. And that doesn't mean taking it back off the user and doing it yourself. What's the point in doing this if I've got to do it? Let's let the user be more enabled. Let's let them get that out of the box experience. But let's give a bit of courtesy and a bit of good customer service and make sure that they feel fully supported in that process.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah.
So there's two elements, and I often get these muddles about in terms of being able to set configure, and I'm going to say configuration policies and compliance policies. And Ollie, you're going to correct me because they're not both policies.
That's right. Configuration profiles is all about making settings and setting things, and a compliance policy is all about reading things from the device and then making a judgment over whether that device is compliant or not.
And again, a typical problem that we do see is that the configuration profiles, is that what you said?
Yep.
And the compliance policies disagree with each other. So the fact that some of these things aren't working is actually the two have been configured in very different ways, and it's never going to work because you've actually not set your check to check something that you've then gone and configured in the configuration.
Yeah, a simple example of that is a password. So if you insist in your compliance policy that you want a 12-character password and you insist on an 8-character password, when you're putting settings out there, then yeah, users who have fallen in between that are going to have a non-compliant device. So yeah, they've got to match up.
Makes sense. And maybe one for Andy here. So an important part of this is we're starting to come onto the day two operations, but the need to keep a device up to date and maintained and secure for a number of reasons. One is for that user experience. Let's make sure that problems that have been fixed in later versions of Windows or maybe even the software have been fixed. And the other is from a security standpoint. So let's start talking about Windows and maybe immediate Microsoft applications. What is available inside Intune to keep those up to date, and what options have the customers got?
So we've got configuration policies we can apply directly to those Microsoft applications. So things like setting the channel that we want Office to be on to receive its regular updates, having Edge update automatically when user signs in. Those are also things we can do with Chrome, Firefox as well, because we know that's where we're going to sort of see probably the biggest exploits or biggest score on a vulnerability scan. We can also have update rings for the operating system, which is quite important. So gone are kind of the days of our WSAS updates and ticking which updates we want to apply. No one wants to do that job, let's face it. So it's sort of little and often that we're going through and we're applying these updates. So what we would normally do is have a sort of update ring that receives these slightly earlier than everyone else, so we can test the compatibility against the software set that may be on the devices, and then we can get them going to the entire organization and making sure they're applied in a timely manner and not interfering with the user too much.
Makes sense. And Ollie, there's a couple of different licensable features, I think, isn't there, that are to do with Windows updates. One is the rings that I think everyone gets, and the other one is maybe give you a few more options.
Yeah, Windows Auto Patch is a thing that basically automatically configures those rings for you. So it'll work out how many devices you have and then put the appropriate number of devices into each ring, so you've got a decent spread. Because you don't want everyone getting an update on day one and then you find actually it's broken one of your line of business systems and everyone's out. Equally, you don't want to wait too long and not get the benefit of the updates. So it's about finding that balance and getting the right numbers of machines into the right groups. And yeah, Windows Autopilot does that. There is a licensing consideration and that you need Windows Enterprise on the device to achieve that.
Makes sense. I think I've got Intune and Autopilot on a number of devices at home because why not? It gives me a chance to do it. I think I'm on the bleeding edge update ring. So as of this weekend, I now have Windows Copilot. I think deployed, so I've got AI straight on the desktop from a Windows key C, I think it is, key press. But I assume there are probably then configurations in Intune to block access to that if I didn't want it and things like that. That tends to be how these things go, that when the new features comes, you can enable them, but equally you can control them or do something else with them.
Yeah, I think it's about keeping up to date with what Microsoft is bringing down, because some of those things are just going to be enabled by default and some of them will be disabled by default. You've got to know, you've got to be on it really to know what's coming down the pipe.
And we can say that we only want to go to a specific feature update, for instance, so 2282. At the moment, we can keep things on that even when further updates come out. It's worth pointing out as well that with these sort of Windows updates that were being applied, we go down the route of having to reset the machine. We're going to reset it back to the point the update's there. So it's not like we're going to have to go through the whole update rigmarole again, which is a good feature.
And I think that's a nice segue then into a day two problem that, well, I suppose both of you, but I'll go to Oli first, and then Andy, maybe you can expand. So we spoke about all the lovely features that we've got around controlling updates for Windows, mainly Microsoft applications, but maybe some other third-party applications. But what about everything else in our, and again, I probably won't get the terminology right, our application repository inside Intune is what I'm going to call it. That is a challenge that we do see customers facing at the moment, isn't it? Oli, do you want to kind of touch upon that?
Yeah, it's one of those problems around how you deal with third-party patching. So there's a few different options. One, you just don't do any third-party patching at all, and that's got its own risks. Obviously, you're going to have stale applications that aren't patched up to date. If you have got a third-party patching tool that's just coming in and upgrading your PCs, you're going to end up deploying a brand new PC, and your Intune application, the Intune deployed application, I should say, is going to be out of date, and then the user gets an experience where they're bringing in an older version of the application and getting it patched and updated, and basically the experience of getting a brand new device is going to be sitting there waiting for application patches. So there's ways around that.
And I suppose, Andy, without kind of giving anything away, this is an area we're taking quite seriously and looking at how we can solve for customers. What's the dream here in terms of keeping these things up to date?
The dream is that we could deploy an application, let's say 7-zip, for instance, to a machine, and we know that when a new update comes out for 7-zip, it's going to be ratified, tested, so we know it's a good update, and then deployed out to the machines. Trying to manage it in Intune, it gets quite difficult because you always end up sort of chasing your tail, really. The amount that the applications get updated almost daily in some cases. What we want to do is sort of try and take that problem away from the support engineers, so they're not constantly looking at an app screen and uploading new apps each day that it comes out.
Definitely, and this is an area that myself, Oli, and Andy are looking at for our customers, and we hope maybe early Q1 next year to be able to offer some services around helping you maintain your applications in your Intune repository, make sure that their applications are always the latest, or at least the latest that are fully tested and known to be good and working. So if that's a challenge that you are facing, please reach out to me, Oli or Andy, or one of the computer account managers, because we think we've got the solution in place to be resolving that, and hopefully beginning of next year would be good to be talking to you guys about that. So an area that has been quite interesting to me, and Andy, I'll come to you on this first, see if you've got any thoughts. Microsoft are now firmly a security provider. I think if we'd said that 5, 6, 7 years ago, we would have laughed, because I think typically, I think there've been a number of failed starts from Microsoft to become a security company. Certainly, I remember in my distant past selling antivirus that Microsoft had released off the shelves and things like that. But the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, which I think is what it's called now, used to be ATP. They love changing the names on us just to see if we're paying attention. Really does come to life when Intune's utilised, isn't it? Without Intune, it can be a little bit difficult. What are your thoughts and experiences with Defender in conjunction with Intune, especially around sort of risk management and risk awareness and things like that?
Yeah, so very, very good. So in the sort of simplest cases, it will install, it will configure, and will also do a sync between our Intune devices and the Defender console. So we'll see everything in there. We can tie a compliance policy to it as well to make sure that we've got that in there and it's all up to date. From the security console, we can then see a list of recommendations, for instance, on machines. So which updates to apply, which configuration policies that we need to apply. When we look at those, it'll also tell us sort of how to apply them. So a lot of the time you still see the group policy method, but as with everything in Intune, anything you can do with a group policy, you can normally 9 times out of 10 do it with an Intune policy. So we can then look at that, apply that to a machine or a subset of machines, and then we can see that risk score lower. So we can see us ticking those things off. There may be certain ones in there that we can't do, or maybe like an add-in that needs to run for an application to work. So for those, we can put actually in the console what we're doing to remediate it, or if we're not going to look at it, and that will affect our score as well. So we're sort of we can see the wood through the trees, I suppose, because we're not just getting a big sheet of this is everything that's wrong. We're just seeing the ones that we do really care about, and any new ones that are coming in there. And if we do see something happen, we can then kind of shut that machine down or cut it off from the network. So we know that that's not going to cause an issue.
Definitely. I think for me, I mean, I think, as I say, I think Defender for Endpoint, we've got so many Defenders now, really comes to life when we've got that Intune enabled. It allows us more visibility. Personally, I feel that there is a lack in remediation options available. Some of the things that have really frustrated me where it's pointing out the problem but not giving me a way to resolve it. Whereas I've seen tools like Bitdefender has a similar view, but at a click of a button, it will help me patch that piece of software or change that security policy to go and do that. So I think what I urge customers to do, first of all, if they're talking to me about Defender for Endpoint, is first of all, talk about where are you with your Intune journey, because trying to deploy Defenders for Endpoint without Intune, from my experience using group policy or something like that, it's a bit nasty. And it almost felt to me I was trying to do it whilst having a blindfold on. I knew things were happening, but I didn't have the complete visibility to what was happening. But then I would also just advise people to not just consider their antivirus and how they're being made aware of risk, but how they are remediating the issues that are coming up from the risk profile, but also what other security services might be needed. So a challenge we tend to see in security is there are too many signals coming in. There's too much noise already coming in, and for want of a better term, we see people running around like blue ass flies trying to figure out actually how do we get ahead of these things. And that's where we do see services like MDR services, where an external specialist is able to keep an eye on it, prioritize what we should be doing, and maybe even help with remediation of issues. So services like Bitdefender MDR or Arctic Wolf's SOC as a service or something like that may be helpful. So we'd suggest reviewing the security and making Defender an important part of that, but considering also what might be needed to deliver the full endpoint security that might be required. So let's get on to kind of the final bits now. So I want to talk about common mistakes, and then I want to come to kind of adoption and change management and things like that. So Andy, first of all, what are the common mistakes to avoid? What are the things that people typically end up going down the wrong path and have to be directed out another way?
I suppose one of the main common mistakes that I see is we may have a fleet of machines that are running through Intune and we're happy everything's working all right. We may make some configuration policies or an app install, do that and everything then is still working fine. But we haven't tested the autopilot build process with that on. So it may be, I've seen it previously where maybe some web filtering that's turned up a little bit too high, say. So as it goes through the autopilot process and that configuration gets applied, it then stops the autopilot process from working. So that's kind of the one of the main ones I see. Other ones we sort of touched on a bit with app updates and things, knowing that we've got to out of the box manually update some of the apps there, and also making sure that our configurations and our compliance policies are tight and working together, so we're not they're not fighting against each other. And if a device is coming out of compliance, making sure that we've got a policy in there or a notification just so we know what's happening. So we could set things up like an email to the service desk, for instance, or to the end user saying that a device is not compliant or about to come out of compliance, and what they can do to fix it, just so we've got sort of a running idea of what's happening, because we know that further down the line that's going to affect access to software and data.
It sounds to me like the kind of challenges are, first of all, what configuration profiles are we going to deploy? What works? What do we need? What do we need to secure? Oli, to your bit, where is the complexity against existing group policy, and what is the transition plan between group policy and Intune configuration? We then have the compliance policies and making sure that they align with our configuration profiles. Making sure, again, and I'm guessing something there is, it could be an area that is too far overly complicated. You're trying to measure too many different things that are resulting in more failures, more need for IT to intervene.
From my point of view, I think that's one of the key things when people onboard all their devices, is keeping on top of how many devices are compliant and how many are failing. Because if you've got like 90% of your organization showing up as red in your console, that's not a very useful place to be. You want to be keeping on top of that, seeing why things are failing, drilling into it. The console lets you drill in quite nicely to see where in a compliance policy it's failing, so which particular attribute it's failing on. It's pretty simple. You just got to look at the console.
That kind of continuous review, setting realistic baby steps to get you from where you are today to where you want to be. There's no point jumping into an Intune Autopilot project and expecting you to be 100% compliant all the time. If you start and you're 10% compliant, that's your starting point, and then gradually move it up. Look at how you're alerting and remediating those issues. And then the next thing is all about Autopilot being successful. Is all about, outside of the configuration profiles, is going to be about the applications, and as long as we've been doing things to try and automate desktops, applications have been the challenge here, kind of thing. So Andy, on that point, what challenges do people have with applications, getting them in tune, being successful? What I'm guessing is largely a silent installation that we're trying to achieve during the Autopilot side.
Exactly. Yes, that's it. So one of the bigger challenges there is to get installer to run silently. That will work sort of 90% of the time. Sometimes you get certain software manufacturers that aren't very helpful in letting you know how to do it. So you've got to sort of put it together yourself. My advice would be to sort of get that silent installer running on a machine, so you know that it's running completely through with no issues, and then adding that into Intune to use there. One of sort of the good features of Intune is we've also got an ESP screen there, so we can have core apps installing first, and then we can allow the user to log in and have some of these other apps sort of drifting in behind. So from a user point of view, they can get on and start using the machine, accessing things they need to access earlier.
So that ESP you talk about there, that's the enrollment status page. So it just gives the user a bit of a visual as to what's going on when that device builds, and then you can choose which of the applications are actually absolutely mandatory. When those apps are installed, it'll give you a desktop, but other apps will come along and stream in behind, and the user's then productive a lot earlier.
And it's certainly highlighted to me, and I've got a few applications I use on this desktop at home, but I've automated the installation of all applications on my desktop with Intune. And some of those aren't typical enterprise applications, so the silent install methodologies were really quite difficult. I think one of them is I've got these lights, I forget what they are, the Stream Deck lights kind of thing. And so I've got a Stream Deck control panel piece of software, which it took me about an hour and a half to automate that. A real waste of my time, but gave me a good little taste, Andy, of the kind of thing that you have to do on a regular basis. But what I've noticed is that application auto updates. And the challenge I have with that is the check that I use to put into Intune to check, is this piece of software installed? Is it installed correctly? That actually changed. And I can't remember what I used, whether it was testing a file was there or a version number. But now I get a regular update that application has failed to install whilst the application is running on there. So these are some of the idiosyncrasies, I assume, of trying to get some of these installations working.
Correct. Yeah. So that's it. Could be the MSI GUID has changed, or kind of the actual the value of the EXE is now different as it's moved on. You've sort of expanded into something different there that we see as well, where it's you're there sort of with your light app, At what point or how many people need to have that installed for that to then become a default app for an organization?
Yeah.
We haven't talked too much about the sort of availability of apps as well. So we can publish 100 apps and say we just want to install 5 of them. 95 of them the user can just install themselves when they need it. So that's another great feature that we've got there.
And in terms of that,
it's also about knowing what applications you have deployed. Sorry to talk over you, Barry. Knowing what you've got out there. If you've got a really poor handle on what applications are actually installed, you're not going to be in a very good position to start planning an Intune rollout project. So, yeah, getting a bit of a handle on that is a really good thing.
And in terms of users installing applications, Andy, is that where a enterprise app store comes into place? How does that end up actually working to a user?
Yeah, so it now all runs through the company portal application. So through there, you can see our published apps. We can publish apps to certain users, so only certain users can see certain apps. They've now got the ability to uninstall it through there as well. That's running as a system. So rather than give people sort of RBAC controls where they're admins of their machines to install something specific, we can just run it through system. The great thing about that is it'll report back to us as well. So it'll tell us how many people are installing it. If we've got 99% of the company have installed an available app, then we may as well make it a default one in that instance for everybody.
Makes sense. Any other common mistakes or challenges that we seen people getting into, or is now a good time to kind of move on to our last subject?
I'll bang on about group policy for a little bit, if that's okay. So,
of course,
of course, a lot of people try and mimic what they have in group policy rather than taking the attitude of, look, we configured this 15 years ago, and the business needs have probably changed a little bit since then. Let's look at it fresh. So I always encourage people to know what they have, know what the group policy is doing, but to look at it afresh and saying, actually, did that reflect a business problem of 15 years ago? Is it still relevant?
Definitely.
Yeah,
so
I suppose that just to add to that again, it's like having a strategy that if we've got an existing fleet and we're going to be putting them into Intune, either having sort of a deadline or something set up that when that's going to happen by, because the last thing an organisation wants or needs is to be having to manage two fleets in 2 separate locations. So maybe one with group policy, one with Intune. I would say if we're going to do it, let's sort of jump in with both feet, make sure we've got everything in there. And control it all through the sort of Intune method where possible.
Makes sense. So the final piece here was then kind of about user adoption and change management. Any specific thoughts on that, Oli?
No. We're probably going to cut here, aren't we?
No. But I think for me, kind of thing, it's making people aware of it. I mean, the thing that I see is people that are using Intune, and then you talk about the reset functionality. So this is kind of the service desk, and the bit that I see happening here quite often is the fact that a project has been done. It's done by maybe a team of architects in a company, kind of thing, and you ask them how's it going, and they go, yeah, Intune's working really well. And then you drill into it a little bit more. You go, well, it would be working well if service desk knew how to use it, and then you speak to the service desk team, and they're just simply not aware of what's gone on or what features could be there and to benefit them. I mean, Andy, in terms of kind of those real life projects and deploying this, what challenges do you see around, whether it's end users, whether it's sort of the middle of the IT team, top of the IT team?
I think a lot of it goes down to communication to the user. They don't want to know a lot of sort of the mumbo jumbo jargon, that kind of thing. But if they were going to be doing something differently, they need to know what it is they're doing differently. So if we're resetting a machine, or if they're going to be logging into it, they may now have to use MFA, or we may say that there's a part of compliance that relies on your password being a certain length, for instance. So it's just a bit of an education piece for the user, so they know that these policies and why they're coming in. We can automate a lot of it, so we can automate things like when their machine's built, we can get it to send them an email. So sort of something, a nice little setup, bit of information there, some user training links or something like that. Also, like as I said earlier, if a device isn't going to be compliant, we can email the user some instructions on how to make that compliant, what they may need to do there.
So I think, as you say, communication's key, and you completely got it right there, Andy. Wherever there is a change, let's not kind of try and explain what Intune and Autopilot is to the end users, but actually what are the benefits of this project for them? How are things going to be better for them? How is it going to help them in the future, and make it relatable to those that are involved? And the same goes for someone like a service desk. Again, they might not need to know all the inner workings, but actually where are the bits that are going to benefit them, make their life easier, allow them to deliver a better experience. So I think we've covered a lot here with regard to model management, Intune, Autopilot. I personally think we're touching the surface of what is possible with these technologies. And I'm quite interested to see what Microsoft's strategy is moving forward, whether they wish to bring more into their portfolio, or whether there's going to be more APIs and more hooks and more ability to plug stuff into Intune and Autopilot to allow it to be more extensive. I think we've also then got technologies like AVD and Windows 365 that overlap in with these technologies. So I think it's really exciting. To me, I think it's one of the most important areas that IT need to be getting on top of, to be able to deliver that balance of user experience plus the controls around security to make sure that people are being secure in this world. So Andy, Oli, thank you very much for joining us. For those that have listened this far, if you'd like to talk to us about Intune, Autopilot, what's possible in your environment, you'd like to have a review of what's going on with Oli, or you'd like Andy or someone in his team to come in and help you get Autopilot and Intune configured just right for you, then please reach out to your computer or account manager or myself on LinkedIn. For those that would like to dig into the world of modern workspace a little bit more, highly recommend you head over to definetomorrow.co.uk. We are running our annual customer conference in Bristol on the 30th of November. There's going to be 200 customers there. We've got speakers coming in from Microsoft, from various different cybersecurity companies. We've got fantastic industry speakers as well. So we'd love you to see there. It's free to attend. Hopefully you'll take a lot away from that. But without any further ado, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to speaking to you next month.